Soares. I'm a horror writer. I have about 5 novels out right now and a short story collection. My new story collection is called Something Blue and Other Colorful Deaths. Came out from Trepid Audio Publishing, and it's actually kind of like a career spanning one because it includes my first professional sale back in like 2001, and they were all the way up to having a couple of stories that were brand new to the collection. I tried to pick the best stories. I thought it was a pretty definitive collection as far as just a good introduction to what I do. My first novel, Life Rage, won the Stoker Award for first novel. When it was up for the award, my best friend Pete Dudar was also nominated in the same exact category. And for some reason, I thought he was going to be the one who would win it because people kept coming up to him and going, "Hey, you're going to win it. You're going to win it." But then when they called my name, I was like kind of shocked.
How did it feel getting nominated at all?
Oh, it felt great. Yeah.
Because your first novel is,
yeah,
that's a big thing to...
And that publisher really did a good job of getting the word out, so it was pretty cool. My first book is Life Rage, and that basically is about one guy is like an anger management kind of psychiatrist, but he's also a demon who feeds off anger. So it's like the perfect job for him. There's a woman who's a demon who she has sex with people, and then she knows how to click something in their head where they die. And there's a bunch of different characters too, like a lot of human characters as well, and they all interact. Eventually, a bunch of people have to go against the anger demon because he becomes too powerful and goes insane. So basically, that's pretty much the bulk of it.
I'm curious, like, what started that novel? Like, what kicked it off?
You know what? I had been writing science fiction for a long time, and I was just getting into horror. I think I just joined the HWA or something. And it was like my first attempt at a horror novel. And I mean, it's not that much different from science fiction. All genre fiction is somewhat related. So it wasn't like it was like, oh, I'm doing something brand new. But it was the first time I sat down and said, I'm definitely going to write a horror novel. And my most recent novel, Teach Them How to Bleed, is a variation on vampires. But like, I wanted to do something a little different. So instead of having them have fangs, like each individual person has a different way of feeding. Like there's a woman who's like a former drug addict, and she gets all these needles on her skin, like these tiny needles that extract blood. Another guy has like these suctions like leeches. Mm-hmm. Like it's almost as if each individual person has their own signature or something. Yeah. And it's just basically about a guy who becomes a vampire type creature against his will, and then he's furious and he just wants to kill every one of them he can find. And then there's also a few other characters, like there's a character who changes sexuality throughout the book called LB Jade, and she's basically a hunter as well. And then the rest of the characters are a mixture, but mostly are like people who become vampires and what happens to them. And there's also one demon type character who lives in a bottle, who I guess like this occultist had trapped or something, and it gets out and it gravitates to one of the vampires and kind of makes her even more powerful.
How would you explain the concept of genre?
I think genre is like where mainstream fiction would be like a wider canvas. Mm-hmm. Genre just seems like a subcategory that would be more interesting to people who love that topic. It has always been treated differently. Like I noticed even in the papers and stuff, like when you're trying to get promotion and stuff, like hardly any newspapers write reviews of horror books. Once in a while the New York Times does, stuff like that. But for the most part, you're kind of shut out. At the same time, you're doing something you love and there's other people who are doing the same thing. So it's not like you're alone, but I do wish that there was more openness in the media and the press, because almost every genre has some good stuff. I mean, science fiction had great stuff. Crime fiction does.
If you had to describe the style of your work, how would you describe it?
It took a really long time, but I guess I really wanted to be kind of original and have my own voice. You know, when you start out as a writer, a lot of times you're doing pastiches of other writers because you love them so much, but it does take a long time to really write something where you think that only I could write that, like nobody else could. I've always been really hung up on being original, like doing books, which has actually been detrimental at times because the new book is like a vampire book, and people can understand that, and if they're into that, they can go toward it. But a lot of my other books were more like I was trying to do something unique. It's not as embraced as much in the genre because it's a genre. I guess they love the tropes. I do try to inject like very dark humor into my stuff, just to alleviate the tension sometimes. I do like really dark and almost like bleak storyline elements. I think the humor also kind of, it not necessarily brings hope, but it does lighten the darkness. So I like that. I really love characters, and the characters are way more important to me than the plot. I try to have simple plots and just really concentrate on the characters and just try to flesh them out as much as possible. And I do try to do a lot of different types of characters just to make it more universal. Try to make characters that seem believable and that you might want to meet or not. But just make, I don't know, like the characters, everything.
What was the first thing you wrote where you really felt it was your voice, like you had nailed it?
It wasn't the first time, but it was the time I really took notice, was my novel Buried in Blue Clay, because it's set in a fictional city in Massachusetts that I created called Blue Clay. A lot of it I took from my growing up in New Bedford. That I figured that way I wouldn't lose track of where things are and location stuff, because I could always have a counterpart in real life. I guess because that book was like so personal, and I had put like so much into it, like from my memories and stuff like that, that it just seemed like this is something that nobody else could write just because it's so personal. Originally, I introduced it in a short story called Second Chances that was on GothicNet, like in the early, maybe like 2005 or so, 2007. And I wrote a few other stories that were set there, but Buried in Blue Clay is the first novel.
I find I read a lot of novels, and I know that the writer is writing it in the hopes that it will become a screenplay.
Yeah.
And it always lets me down because I'm like, I
want to enjoy the novel.
Yeah, I want to enjoy the novel. I want the things that a novel can do. Have you noticed that same trend, or? Somewhat.
I'm very visual, so I kind of write that way, like very much into imagery and, stuff like that could translate well into film. And I wouldn't mind if that happened, but at the same time, I agree, like you have to focus on the thing at hand. It's not a stepping stone to something else.
Right.
Yeah. I try to make more of a parallel, like I try to bring like some filmmaking sensibility to the writing. But yeah, I do feel that there are a lot of people who they just want to be famous and they don't really care about the book so much. They just want to do whatever it takes to become famous.
Well, what are your work habits in terms of writing?
My work habits are actually very impulsive, I guess, almost. There's no structure, really. I work a day job where I'm also a writer-editor for an engineering firm. All day I'm doing that. And sometimes when the day comes to an end, I want to write, it does still feel like work in a way, because I'm working from home too since the pandemic. I don't write every day. I write usually more on the weekends. But it's really tough to juggle a day job and writing, because writing is work. It's not easy. What dragged me into horror again were people like Clive Barker and all the splatterpunk writers and stuff like that. I really was excited about that time period in horror. I just wanted to be part of it.
Yeah, it was an amazing time period.
It was.
I remember when Clive Barker came out, and that just, for me, it changed everything.
It did, yeah.
It was like...
It was a totally new voice, yeah. And he also brought in a lot of like unusual, like, S&M and stuff like that that nobody else had done before.
Yep. And the first time you really got representation of like the gay community.
Exactly. You probably know this already, but when Books of Blood came out, that was like what grabbed me. And the American versions were okay, but I actually got a British version that he did the art for. And those are like beautiful, really interesting artists, almost like Francis Bacon kind of stuff. Yeah. So it's very cool. Yeah, the Books of Blood were great. The Damnation Game. And then like splatterpunk books were like taboo and boundary pushing kind of stories. And That's what really got me, because when I was into science fiction, I was heavily into the new wave, who was almost the same exact thing. It was like, let's make the genre adult instead of having it, like stuck in the 50s or whatever. And that's when all the experimentation happened. So I didn't think the horror stuff was experimental as much, but it definitely pushed boundaries. And basically, that's what I look for in horror: stuff that pushes the boundaries and tries to get a little deeper into you, like the stuff that really is like, it can be disturbing at times, stuff like that.
Yeah. What kind of authors would you put in that camp?
All right, there's tons. Joe Lansdale, I love. Poppy Z. Bright, who is Billy Martin. I love when his books, especially Exquisite Corpse when that came out, and Skip Inspector. I'm wearing a shirt by Fritz Leiber. It's one of his books. He was way before them, but he was one of these writers who wrote science fiction, horror, fantasy, all kinds of stuff. In fact, he wrote a book called The Silver Eggheads that was about writers who don't write, and computers write all the stuff. And all they do is just go around and like do talk shows and stuff.
We're getting very close to that reality.
I know, yeah.
It's scary.
That's kind of wild. But his book, he wrote some horror too. He wrote Conjure Wife and a couple of other things. But Our Lady of Darkness was like his last book. And when I was in high school, I actually wrote to a few writers, and he was one of the ones that wrote back. Him, Ted Sturgeon, Isaac Asimov sent me like a postcard back with a signature, and Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune, actually responded. So that was kind of cool. I mean, there's so many other writers. Oh, Ray Garton, definitely. Dallas, for sure. Dallas is definitely, The Girl Next Door is definitely one of my favorite horror novels ever.
Yep.
Richard Lehman. I like Wrath James White and Ed Lee. I've always been a big Ed Lee fan. I mean, there are some splatterpunk and extreme horror fiction people I still read, but not as much. I went through a lot of periods where I explored different kinds of fiction. Like in college, it was mostly transgressive fiction. People like William S. Burroughs, Bukowski, Henry Miller, because these people were just so fresh. They were so different. And then I do really love crime fiction, and I'm a huge fan of Jim Thompson. But his stuff is so dark, it's almost like horror in a way sometimes. But I mean, there's a lot of really great people too, like Raymond Chandler, and there's a lot of, even like Elmore Leonard, and Joe Lansdale writes some crime fiction with the Happy Leonard books and stuff like that. But crime fiction really seems to me very close cousins with horror, because they're both very dark, or they can be.
Yeah, a lot of Dallas's stuff, a lot of his like early stuff came right out of true crime.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
Like you take specific cases and then fictionalize them.
Like something like Girl Next Door could be considered crime.
Yeah.
It's based even on a real thing,
Yep.
yeah. And yet, the way he wrote it, I do think it is horror. Actually, to bring up Dallas, like a lot of things he told me I thought were really interesting. Like he told me, like, I've heard this 100 times, but the whole thing about horror as an emotion. He said even like Moby Dick could be considered a horror novel if you read it a certain way. He at one time he was a literary agent, and he was Henry Miller's agent. And I guess Henry Miller was pretty old, and he got him like his last couple of books published or something. But he was all excited about that, and I thought that was pretty cool. He also did music writing, rock writing, and he was for a time period he was on the Cream staff of writers. So he knew Lester Bangs, and I'm really into music, and I think Lester Bangs was probably like the best rock critic ever. So I thought that was kind of cool too. The thing that was so interesting about Dallas was that he did like so many things, and he had so many stories. It wasn't just horror. I just thought that was really interesting, because he had done like so many things I thought were cool. And then you'd read his fiction, and it's like really, he went pretty far. Yeah. But he was the nicest guy.
Yep.
And I do think that it's become a cliche about horror writers, but I do think we get a lot of our anger and negative feelings out in our writing. And I think we might be a little more well adjusted than some people. I think a lot of times too, like a lot of people avoid their dark side because either they feel guilty or whatever. And I think horror writers maybe embrace that a little more. That's why there's a balance.
Henry Miller is one of my favorite writers. And it's like you could not really make a movie out of what's special in his books.
He was weird because he would sometimes go off on these like surrealistic tangents,
Hmm.
which I always thought was interesting. And everybody equates him with like, graphic sex.
Hmm.
But I thought like a lot of his ideas about culture and stuff were really interesting too.
Yeah.
Like when he was a messenger and he had all these stories about how people treated him or how that work was and stuff. Like I don't know. Another thing too, like a lot of writers don't really seem to have jobs, like normal jobs.
Hmm.
And I just think it's interesting when they do and they
Yeah.
have a take on it, like Bukowski with the
Bukowski,
post
yeah.
office, yeah, and stuff like that. So I always thought that was cool. Probably my favorite writer of all though was probably J.G. Ballard. My favorite of his is Crash, that Cronenberg made into a movie, and I thought that was great. And I'm really angry there's another movie called Crash that won the Oscar.
Oscar.
Because whenever you bring it up, they think you're talking about that movie.
Yep.
And I really didn't care about that movie.
Yeah, and they are very, very different.
And that seemed like almost like a preachy movie. Oh, another writer I wanted to talk about just briefly anyway is Harlan Ellison.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought like he was like the best short story writer ever. And I just thought he was a great writer. But if I got anything from him as far as influence, he wrote very personal stuff too. And I always found, like in his collections, he always wrote like these long things about like how the story got written or things like that. And I always found that like so fascinating. And he was the kind of writer who didn't pull any punches, like he told you, like very personal stuff, like breakups or just not his best moments and stuff like that.
Yeah,
He was pretty open about
fearless.
that. I think I saw him like around 5 or 6 times over the years. I remember one time he was on a tour with Neil Gaiman and Peter David.
Hmm.
And it was like, I mean, like every time I saw him, he was great. I've gone to conventions just to see him speak. Really great writer. I mean, I like Stephen King, but I was never like a huge fan.
Hmm.
And it didn't draw me into horror. But Clive Barker was so different. He was definitely more and it had like a punk sensibility too.
Yeah, yeah,
So
definitely.
I totally gravitated to that. And I've always loved stuff that was like controversial or,
Mhm.
although now it's touchy now. Because if you're trying to be controversial, you could definitely fuck yourself over. When I was in high school, that's around the time when like Nevermind the Bullocks came out and a bunch of punk albums, The Clash and stuff like that. And so I was into it pretty early on. I think like that whole sensibility too has definitely affected me. Well, a lot of punk was like protests about what was going on in the world.
Hmm.
I always thought like that was kind of cool and try to adopt that as well. But music seems very much a part of who I am too. Like I know I was posting about jazz and I'm thinking about maybe doing blues at some point too. But punk rock has always been like my favorite.
Hmm.
And I wasn't really heavily into music until I discovered it. And then I find, finally something I love.
Especially at that time, it really spoke to people.
It did.
And it was a very activating genre.
Like they'll say, like, in the early days, the Pistols didn't have like a lot of people in the audience. They just had like people who go see them over and over again. And yet everybody in that audience probably started a band of their own. I really think like jazz was almost like the punk of its time. It definitely was a reaction to the more mainstream society of the time. It was like the cool music. Yeah.
Yep.
I just think it's really good music to write to as well. Maybe because there's no lyrics and stuff, but
Yep. Do you always write to music?
I used to. I didn't. Sometimes now it's a toss up. But I really loved like stuff like movie soundtracks, stuff like that was really good. Like the band Goblin, who did a lot of Argento's soundtracks. They're excellent to listen to while you're writing. Or even like Ennio Morricone, like with all his Western scores and stuff. For some reason, a lot of the really good scores are from Italy. I don't know what happened to him, but early on he was such a stylist, and everything was about music and art and colors and stuff like that. And his new movies just seem like very straightforward, and they don't have any sense of style to them.
Yeah, they're different. You put it next to Suspiria, and you wouldn't even know it's the same.
No, you wouldn't.
Same director.
Someone told me they thought it was because his wife, I guess she wrote a lot of the scripts with him, like
Mhm.
Suspiria and stuff like that. And some people said that, after she died, maybe that took something away. But I don't know how that would affect like cinematography and stuff. I like at the beginning of like Deep Red. There's a scene where it's just a camera focusing on a bunch of different items. Like I think it's like a necklace and like there's all these like things. I I'm assuming that they all tie into the story somehow if you really examined it. But it's just the camera panning a bunch of things and then Goblin's music playing over the soundtrack. And for some reason, it's almost like a music video, but it's really cool. And it's one of these things where if I'm high or something, I'll watch it over and over again. And it has like a really good effect on me. I just really like it. So, and it has nothing to do with horror. And it has nothing to do with the stories of his movies. It's just a style.
Yeah, you're watching it because it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Basically, and moving and interesting.
A few decades back, there were like a lot of directors who had like definite style, like we were talking about style before. But it doesn't seem like that's as valued as much now. I mean, there's still a few people who do it. I love Panos Cosmatos, who did Mandy and a bunch of other movies.
Oh, yeah.
And his stuff has that surreal quality, and he does play with light and color and stuff. And I just thought, I think he's one of my favorites of like the current directors. I love Gaspar Noé. I've seen everything of his except for like the most recent one, I think. His most recent one is about an old couple, and one of the people in it is Argento. He plays like the old man, and I guess his wife's suffering from dementia or something. I haven't seen that one yet. Climax I liked a lot. Climax came out at a time when the remake of Suspiria had come out, like around the same time, and they both were heavily about dance. And I thought that was really fascinating because dance really isn't in movies very much, and these two movies almost seemed like totally focused around it. And they were horror movies, and I thought that was really cool. And while I don't think the remake of Suspiria was anything like Argento's movie, I really kind of consider it like a totally different movie.
Yep.
I really like it a lot. I don't like it as much as Argento's, but I like that he didn't just copy it.
Yeah.
That he did his own thing. And I mean, there are some elements that are kept from the story, but for the most part, he takes it in his own direction, and I thought that was cool. My favorite of his films is Enter the Void. Like, I'm not religious, but it's kind of like about reincarnation. Then it becomes very surreal, and then at the end, well, I don't want to give it away, but it's probably the most religious-related movie my favorite of that kind of film, just because it was just such a unique experience. And it's not as dark as some of his other movies, like Irreversible and stuff.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that in the theater and just being psyched that somebody was doing that. Like, another thing with style too is I really love when movies actually push buttons, because it happens so rarely. Do you remember like Peter Greenaway movies? Were you into him at all? The Cook, the Thief, his wife and her lover, and Travis Contract.
Set in Two Knots.
Yes. But like, especially in Cook and Thief, I remember like he would have rooms that are completely red or like, all white or something like that. It's just like little things like that, like nobody seems to really do anymore. Except for maybe like David Lynch. David Lynch has always been really interesting visually. Yeah. Any chance you get to see something with some style in it, like you said, it doesn't feel as soulless. Like when I was in maybe college, I saw Texas Chainsaw for the first time. And that scene where the kids are in the house and all of a sudden that door comes open. And it's Leatherface with the chainsaw. That like freaked me out. And that's like so weird because horror movies never scare me. So it just felt cool to be finally scared again. So I do kind of seek out movies like that. There's a movie called Martyrs that is very controversial.
Yeah, that
it's
last
brutal.
scene is brutal.
But the scene after that ruling scene, where she whispers something in that woman's ear, and the woman's reaction is kind of like makes the whole thing, like, it's not gratuitous. Like, it made everything that happened beforehand make sense.
Yeah.
And there's this real strong parallel with Joan of Arc too. Like, even some of the filming reminds me of that Carl Dreyer movie about Joan of Arc from the 20s. Like the way her face is like beatific. And I think that's like a work of art. But that's the kind of movie I can't really recommend to a lot of people. Because it's so disturbing. But that made me feel like similar to where I felt back in the old days with Chainsaw, because it happens so rare.
When you look at like the world today, what problems stand out to you as most important?
I think the whole divisiveness between people right now is really bad, and it's just going to get worse unless something changes. And I don't know, the whole world has kind of changed right now since the pandemic. I mean, during our lifetime, we never thought we'd see something like that. I mean, with all technology and everything, like, why would there be a total shutdown for years? That was insane. And I think it just changed everybody's life. I know some people who had negative effects because, they weren't able to socialize and stuff like that. But I've always been kind of reclusive, so it didn't really bother me very much. And also, it really does seem like climate change is becoming a real issue with all the heat lately and everything. But I think in this country, I mean, I know it's happening around the world, but I think The divisiveness is just getting out of control. It's insane.
What do you think could counter that?
I'm not really sure. Maybe a leader who could draw everybody together, but I don't know if that's going to happen. But I really don't know. It just seems like a problem that just keeps getting worse and worse. And I hope like it doesn't erupt into like violence and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But actually, stuff like that does kind of tie into life rage, which is all about rage. Back then, it was like all about like road rage was a big thing, stuff like that. Now it just seems like people have rage for everything. So the book is even more relevant now.
What do you think is causing the rage?
I think a lot of it's being stoked by different medias of different people so that it seems like it's us against them instead of, all of us being together. I mean, there's no reason to be fighting among each other. And nobody can really accept each other anymore. And there's a lot of people, for some reason, if they don't understand something, their first reaction is anger and they hate it. And they don't even try to understand it, which I always found odd because I was never really like that. I don't really do Twitter that much, and I know like people even go on TikTok and stuff, and I know that probably would help as far as promoting the books, but it's just so difficult to find the time for it. And when I was younger, I used to go on a lot of message boards online and a lot of stuff like that, and it took up so much time. And then if like a conflict happened, like somebody was angry at something you wrote and you were arguing, that could take up like a whole weekend, and it was like, what a waste. And I just really cut back on that because I just wanted to have more time for writing. And even when I go on Facebook, I have like definite limits of how long I'll go on, like an hour or something. And I know some people are on all day and always checking their phone, but I try to limit it to an hour because I don't want to get sucked into it again.
Yeah.
I really don't want to give other people, especially if they're going to write something negative, that much of my life.
You have very good taste. You have very broad taste.
Yeah.
And you're very good at like communicating it. So you open up like a lot of work to me.
Oh,
like
cool.
your jazz posts, like I wrote everything down.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't think anybody was reading those.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad you like the jazz ones because I really didn't think anybody was paying attention.
No, it's like I said, you love a lot of stuff, but you're generous with what you love. You have good taste. I think you do.
Cool.
And you share that stuff and you share it in a way that makes it accessible to other people.
I guess I always had that feeling that if I find something I really love, I want to share it. Not everybody has the time to look at all these different things. And if I find something I really like, I just want everybody to know about it. And, pretty much I want to make it clear if it's something you would be interested in, you'll know, and you'll probably seek it out. I'm not really sure how to describe it, but I go through these periods where there are certain things I really love and I focus on them. Mm-hmm. But eventually I'll get bored and I'll go on to something else. And it's like this really, I have a lot of emotion for it, a lot of passion. Eventually I'm going to turn to something else. But the reason I do that is I always have something new. And I'm trying to expose myself to new things. And I just figured that can only help my writing.
How can people find out more about you?
Okay, well, I'm on Facebook. I do have a website, llsoares.com. If anybody, is on Facebook and wants to friend me or comment on stuff, that's always welcome.
You're very accessible. So.
I try to be, yeah.
Any messages for the writers of the future?
Just keep doing it because we have to keep things going. The new generation new blood is always so important. And I definitely see a lot of that now. There's a lot of young writers coming up who are like more or less going to replace us. But we need that.